Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that's probably going to make you grateful for modern cuisine, medieval food. Picture yourself in a cold, stone-walled kitchen lit by a flickering candle, the air thick with the smell of stale bread and overcooked meat. You're hungry, but not sure if what's in front of you is edible or if it'll even stay down after you take a bite. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, feel free to drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. I'm always curious about time zones. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Medieval food was, well, it was terrible. If you had been alive during the Middle Ages, you would have spent a lot of your time chewing on tough, tasteless, or downright horrifying food. Sure, there were feasts for the wealthy, but let's be real. The daily diet for most people would have made you seriously question your life choices. To start, food in this era was less about variety and more about survival. The vast majority of people lived in a world where flavor didn't matter nearly as much as keeping your stomach full. Let's talk about bread first, because really, what else could be more symbolic of medieval life than a hard pizza, stale loaf of bread? Bread was the foundation of pretty much every meal, and for most people, it was also the only meal. But don't think of this as a warm, soft baguette you get with your fancy dinner nowadays. No, the bread you would have eaten in medieval times was often hard, dry, and sometimes a little too authentic for your liking. Many of these loaves could last for days, sometimes weeks. The trick was, they didn't just last, they were rock hard. You could knock on a piece of bread with your knuckles, and it'd probably sound like a door. Now, you'd think that this dense, unappetizing loaf would at least be nutritious, right? Well, in theory, sure, but there was always the risk that it had been stored improperly or had gotten a bit too old. And then there was the real kicker: mold. That's right, mold. If it was a particularly humid year, there was a good chance that the bread you were eating was already starting to grow some unwanted green or blue patches. But hey, food waste wasn't a thing back then, so you ate it anyway. What's a little fungus between friends? Historians still argue about how widespread moldy bread really was. But one thing's for sure: the average medieval person didn't have much choice in what they ate, so they probably ate a lot of stale bread. The loaf was typically made from rye or barley wheat, if you were lucky and could afford it. And by the time the bread was stale, it wasn't exactly a pleasant experience. You had to break it into chunks, soak it in some water, or dip it in a broth to soften it up enough to chew. not exactly the kind of meal you'd be excited about. Bread wasn't the only unsatisfactory thing on the menu. In fact, the very notion of what made food edible during the Middle Ages is bizarre by modern standards. Preservation, for instance, was a huge challenge. You couldn't just go to a store and buy fresh ingredients every day. If you wanted meat, it had to be preserved somehow, through salting, smoking, or drying. And trust me, you didn't always get fresh cuts of anything. More often than not, the meat was tough, stringy, and sometimes had a hint of something off. The idea of fresh was relative. If you had a piece of beef that wasn't putrid, it was considered a treat. Historians still argue over how widespread foodborne illness was due to bad preservation techniques, but there's a general consensus that medieval folks were no strangers to bad meat. Spoiled meat, on the other hand, wasn't so much a special treat as it was a common experience. And let's not even get into the exotic meats that occasionally found their way onto a noble's table. Everything from swan to peacock was served, though it's hard to imagine those meats tasting much better than they sound. So here you are, staring down a meal that's mostly bread and whatever tough, questionable meat has been haphazardly thrown together, seasoned with a little salt and, if you're lucky, a few spices. But that brings us to a curious part of medieval cuisine: spices. In the medieval world, spices were a luxury reserved for the wealthy. You might think, great, spices will make the food taste better. Well, kind of. The rich would splurge on expensive spices like cinnamon, pepper, and cloves, using them to flavor meat, often overpowering the natural taste. But here's the kicker: spices also served a very practical purpose. They were sometimes used to mask the unpleasant taste of rotten or spoiled food. This is where things get interesting. Historians still argue whether the use of spices in medieval cooking was primarily about flavor or a clever method of disguising bad food. What we do know is that spices were not only costly, but also symbolized status. If you could afford cinnamon and cloves, you were doing pretty well for yourself. But in reality, a lot of people, especially the lower classes, had to make do with a lot of bland, unseasoned food. It's not all bad news, though. At least some of the medieval diet had some nutritional value. Vegetables, while not as prevalent as you might hope, were included in pottage, a kind of porridge or stew made with a variety of ingredients. This one-pot wonder could be packed with nutrients from peas, beans, and whatever veggies you could find, though in many cases, the texture was less than appetizing. Plus, it might take hours to cook, making it the ultimate test of patience and perseverance. Now that we've set the stage for the grim medieval food scene, let's focus on something a bit more substantial. If you were living in the Middle Ages, meat was the star of the show. At least, it was if you could afford it. For most peasants, The concept of having meat as a regular part of their diet was a pipe dream. Instead, they might have eaten a lot of beans, grains, and whatever small animals they could catch, like rabbits or chickens. But when it came to those grand, noble feasts, meat was king. The problem, though, it wasn't the kind of meat you'd want to sink your teeth into. Now, you might think of medieval meat as this juicy, tender roast, glistening under a perfect glaze. The truth, however, is far less appetizing. Most meat in the Middle Ages was preserved by salting, smoking, or drying, and it didn't always have the freshest taste. When people slaughtered animals, they had to find ways to keep the meat from spoiling, since refrigeration wasn't a thing. In the case of salt-cured or smoked meats, you could easily end up with something that was tough, dry, and almost impossible to chew, without risking a jaw workout that would rival any gym session. Historians still argue about just how much salt-cured meat was actually tasty as opposed to merely edible. One thing is clear: though this preservation method, while necessary, didn't really do meat any favors in terms of flavor. The texture was tough, and the taste could often be overpowering with salt or smokiness, with a touch of rancid undertones. If you were lucky enough to get a fresh piece of meat, say a chicken or a lamb, there's a decent chance that it was still tough and stringy, since animals were often slaughtered when they weren't exactly at their prime. The preservation process didn't just affect the quality of meat. It also played a role in the various culinary creations that came from medieval kitchens. Take, for example, medieval sausages. Oh yes, those spicy, greasy links that you might imagine were delightful. But in reality, medieval sausages were made from all sorts of random bits of animal, not just choice cuts of pork. You might have found yourself eating a sausage made from old xajia, stringy beef mixed with some unpleasant leftover parts of the animal that no one else wanted. The seasoning, heavy on the salt, with some spices to mask the smell. Was it tasty? Maybe if you liked chewing on something that could double as a shoe sole. Now, if we take a step back and think about how people ate their meat, we're faced with some grim realities. Not only was the quality questionable, but the tools they had to cook with didn't help much either. You didn't have shiny new kitchen gadgets or precise cooking methods. Instead, medieval cooks relied on open fires, crude pots, and large cauldrons, which could result in uneven cooking. This led to burnt outsides and undercooked insides, leaving you with meat that was either charred or raw. Still, you ate it because that was often all there was. But the real kicker here is that meat, no matter how tough, salty, or stringy, was seen as a symbol of wealth. If you could afford to eat meat regularly, you were doing pretty well. A peasant, on the other hand, could expect to see meat only on rare occasions, often reserved for special feasts or celebrations. And even then, It wasn't exactly a prime cut of anything. So, if you found yourself at a grand banquet, you could get lucky and be served something like roast beef, venison, or even boar. But the chances of it being tender, slim to none. Historians still argue about whether the use of certain cooking techniques in the medieval era, such as roasting meat over an open fire, resulted in a better taste than boiling, which was often a common method. Some suggest that boiling preserved the meat's moisture, but boiling also meant the meat became bland and watery. Roasting, on the other hand, produced tougher meat, but it added that crispy, golden brown finish that many nobles still believed was worth the hassle. One thing's for sure. Though medieval meat didn't have the modern-day magic touch, there was no such thing as marinating for hours in a flavorful mix of herbs and spices. You couldn't just throw a chicken on the grill and expect it to be cooked to juicy perfection. It was tough, it was chewy, and sometimes it was downright disgusting. The diet of medieval people wasn't all bad, though there were some luxuries for the wealthier folk, like freshly baked bread, roasted meats, and fine wines. But if you weren't a noble, your everyday meal was a far cry from anything appetizing. For most peasants, their meals were a repetitive cycle of beans, oats, and the occasional rabbit stew, all served up with chunks of hard, dry bread. For them, surviving wasn't about enjoying the food. It was about making sure there was enough to fill their stomachs. But if you were lucky enough to be part of the upper class, meat wasn't the only thing you'd have on your plate. Wealthy medieval folk were known for their extravagant banquets, which might feature not only roasted meats, but also exotic dishes like swan, peacock, and even elephant. Yes, you heard that right. Some nobles actually ate elephant meat. But even then, no matter how lavish the feast, there were still strange culinary practices in place that made eating a challenge. For example, people sometimes ate meat that was just beginning to rot. Preservation was an issue even for the wealthiest, and some truly bizarre dishes ended up on the table. So, next time you sit down to a perfectly cooked steak or a roast chicken, take a moment to think about how far we've come from those days of medieval meat. And hey, at least we don't have to worry about chewing through something that could double as a tire. If you think bread and tough meat were the worst of medieval dining, brace yourself. There's a whole lot more to it. Let's talk about something that, in theory, should have been much easier to get right. Vegetables. You know, the good-for-you, nutrient-packed foods that, ideally, make up balanced diet. Well, if you were living in the Middle Ages, vegetables were anything but a daily delight. In fact, they were often overlooked, and when they did appear on the table, they were rarely anything to get excited about. For the peasants, vegetables were often hard to come by, as most of their land was used for growing grains and beans. And let's face it, beans aren't the most exciting addition to a meal. Still, they were the closest thing to a vegetable that many people would have eaten on a regular basis. Beans, peas, and lentils were pretty much the staples of the medieval diet, but not exactly the fresh, crisp produce you might be craving after a long day. More often than not, these legumes were cooked into pottage, essentially, a thick stew made from a mishmash of whatever ingredients you had at hand. But here's where things get even worse. The vegetables that were available in medieval times were often bitter, tough, or overcooked. The cooking methods used back then weren't exactly great for preserving the flavors or nutrients of the vegetables. They were often boiled to the point of mushiness, making them less than appealing. There was also the issue of seasonality. Fresh vegetables weren't always available year-round, so people had to make do with what they could store, which usually meant dried or preserved options. Historians still argue about why vegetables weren't a bigger part of medieval cuisine. Some believe it had to do with the belief that vegetables were food for the poor, after all. The wealthy had access to more luxurious items like meat and fine pastries. There was also the religious factor to consider. In many parts of medieval Europe, vegetables were associated with fasting and penance. The church often promoted the idea that meat was sinful, and eating vegetables was a way of showing humility. For the peasants, this meant that vegetables were often viewed as a necessity rather than a pleasure. But it wasn't just the peasants who struggled with vegetables. Even the nobility had their issues. While they could afford a variety of vegetables, especially exotic ones that came from trade routes or were grown in their private gardens, the quality wasn't always great. Vegetables weren't as highly prized as meat or bread, so they weren't always grown with the same care or attention. As a result, they often ended up being bland, tough, or even somewhat bitter. There was also the matter of preparation. Many noble kitchens didn't bother much with vegetables beyond simple boiling or stewing. If you were lucky, you might have had some spiced vegetables as part of a larger dish, but most of the time, they were just another side dish to fill up space on the table. It wasn't until later centuries that vegetables began to take on a more prominent role in European cuisine. But for the medieval period, they were little more than a way to stretch out a meal and provide some basic nutrition. And while peasants might have had a higher chance of incorporating them into their diet, the nobles were often less concerned about getting their 5 servings of vegetables. They were more interested in the meat, the wine, and, of course, the spice-laden dishes that signified their wealth and status. And then there was the issue of freshness or lack thereof. Even the most well-intentioned vegetables couldn't escape the problem of preservation. With no refrigeration or modern techniques for keeping food fresh, the vegetables that ended up in your pot were often stale, wilted, or on the brink of decay. Sometimes you'd end up with vegetables that were past their prime, which only added to the overall grim nature of the meal. You might be wondering, but what about salads? Well, medieval salads weren't the light, refreshing bowls of mixed greens you might imagine. Instead, they were more likely to be a mixture of herbs and whatever else could be gathered from the garden, often accompanied by vinegar and sometimes eggs. Not exactly the crisp, vibrant salad you're used to today. The herbs used in these salads could be bitter, pungent, or downright unpleasant. And given the lack of proper refrigeration, any fresh vegetables were usually wilting before they even made it to the table. What's even stranger is that vegetables were sometimes used more for medicinal purposes than for eating. The medieval diet wasn't just about staying full. It was also about health. Many vegetables, herbs, and plants were believed to have healing properties, and they were often consumed as remedies for various ailments. Some vegetables were believed to improve digestion, while others were thought to cure common illnesses. In this way, vegetables were treated more like supplements than actual food. But even with all their purported benefits, these vegetables weren't necessarily appetizing. They might have been boiled, dried, or stewed into oblivion, losing much of their original flavor and texture in the process. And the lack of seasoning meant that even if you were eating something healthy, it probably wasn't very satisfying. Historians still debate whether the medieval aversion to vegetables was more about their unappetizing nature or the social stigma attached to them. Some argue that vegetables were simply not seen as food worthy of attention, while others believe that medieval people simply didn't know how to cook them properly. Either way, for the most part, vegetables were a side note in the medieval diet, a necessary evil, if you will, to complement the meat and bread that dominated the table. So, the next time you enjoy a salad or a plate of roasted vegetables, just be thankful you don't have to endure the bland, often bitter fare that medieval folk had to choke down. All right, let's go ahead and dive into another key player in the medieval diet: pottage. This was the one pot wonder that served as a meal staple for both peasants and nobles alike. If you were living in the Middle Ages, chances are you ate pottage on a regular basis. It was cheap, it was filling, and let's face it, it was probably your only option when you couldn't afford anything else. But calling pottage a meal might be a bit generous, because the reality of what this dish actually was isn't quite as appetizing as it sounds. Pottage was essentially a thick stew, but it could take on many forms depending on what ingredients you had available. In the most basic form, it was just water, some kind of grain, often oats or barley, and maybe a few vegetables, depending on the season. If you were lucky, there might be a bit of meat thrown in for flavor. However, most people couldn't afford meat on a regular basis, so pottage for the lower classes was often little more than a gloopy, flavorless mixture of water and grains. It wasn't unusual for people to eat pottage multiple times a day. It was cheap, it filled you up, and, well, that was about it. Not much in the way of flavor or variety. Now, you might be thinking, but grains are good for you, right? Yes, grains are a decent source of energy, But medieval grains weren't exactly the high quality, whole grains you might find today. The grains used for pottage were often rough, coarser varieties, and the process of grinding them wasn't as refined as it is now. So the texture of your pottage could range from thick and lumpy to watery and bland, depending on how much grain you managed to get into your pot. Historians still argue about how much variety there was in the ingredients that went into pottage. Some suggest that the recipe could be spiced up with the addition of herbs or roots, such as onions, leeks, or garlic, and maybe even some dried peas or beans. But these ingredients were often season-dependent, and in many cases, people simply didn't have the luxury of fresh vegetables or herbs, so you were often left with the same basic, monotonous meal day after day. The more affluent members of society had access to a wider range of ingredients, and their pottage could be spiced up with meats such as chicken, beef, or pork. But even for the wealthy, pottage wasn't exactly a delicacy. It was more of a practical, easy-to-make dish that was quick and filling. It was common at noble feasts, where the pottage would be served alongside more extravagant dishes, like roasted meats and pies. It was a humble dish, even at the highest tables. But even for those lucky enough to have some meat mixed in, the pottage itself was still often overcooked. The lack of refrigeration and proper cooking methods meant that meat would usually be simmered for hours in the stew, which made it tough and chewy. And because the pot was often left to simmer for hours over the fire, the result was a dish that could either be too watery or thick enough to stick to your spoon. But no matter how it turned out, the flavor wasn't exactly something to write home about. Interestingly, pottage was also a dish that could be made to stretch. You could throw in whatever scraps you had lying around leftover vegetables, dried beans, some stale bread, or whatever bits of meat you could scrounge up. It was a bit of a clean out the fridge kind of meal, and that meant that it could be surprisingly filling for the poor, who might have had little else to eat. But the idea of pottage being filling and nutritious was more of a survival tactic than anything else. The reality is that many medieval people ate pottage not because it was delicious, but because it was the most reliable meal available to them. For those who were less fortunate, pottage often had to do with making the best of bad ingredients. The lower classes couldn't afford the luxury of fresh produce or quality meat, so they would have to make do with whatever scraps they could gather. This is why pottage sometimes had to be extended with things like barley, oats, and other grains to make it last longer and feed as many people as possible. Sometimes this meant that the meal wasn't quite as appetizing as it could have been. In some instances, pottage could even become moldy or sour, as it was often stored for days before being eaten. So, the next time you sit down to a nice, comforting stew, remember that medieval pottage was the original one-pot meal, But it was a meal that was far from comforting in the modern sense. It was a necessary evil for the majority of people, a dish that filled the stomach, but didn't exactly inspire any joy in the eating. But here's the kicker. Pottage, for all its simplicity and lack of appeal, was incredibly versatile. You could make it with whatever ingredients you had on hand. And if you didn't have enough of anything else, you could always stretch it with more water and grains. It was the ultimate survival food, something that made sure you weren't starving, even if you weren't exactly satisfied. Historians still debate how much variety there really was in medieval pottage. Was it always as bland and watery as we imagine? Or could it occasionally surprise with an unexpected burst of flavor? We may never know, but one thing is clear. Medieval pottage was the cornerstone of the medieval diet, and it was as dependable as it was unexciting. All right, we've covered the basics: bread, tough meat, and the omnipresent pottage. But let's move on to something that, on the surface, sounds like it could help save the day. Spices. You might be thinking, spices make everything better, right? Well, in the case of medieval food, they were more about masking the unpleasantness than enhancing flavor. Let me explain. In medieval Europe, spices were an absolute luxury, while today we can stroll into any grocery store and grab a jar of cinnamon, cumin, or even saffron. Back then, spices were incredibly rare and expensive. If you were lucky enough to have access to them, you'd probably feel like royalty. Though, you'd be just as likely to use them to cover up the taste of spoiled meat as to make your food more flavorful. Now, imagine you've just been served a piece of meat that's been salted, smoked, or maybe even left out a little too long in the warm air. It's tough, a bit rancid, and definitely not something you're eager to chew. What do? You reach for the spices. The medieval elite, who had access to the finest goods from the East and beyond, would lavish their meats with pepper, cloves, ginger, and cinnamon. The idea wasn't necessarily to make the dish taste better. It was about masking the unpleasantness of the meat's age and preservation methods. The spices worked wonders for covering up the smell and taste of food that had seen better days. And in a time before refrigeration, that was a very real concern. Historians still argue whether medieval cooking was fundamentally about flavor or about survival tactics. The wealthy, who could afford to import spices from trade routes in India and the Middle East, were more likely to use these spices for their symbolic value than to improve taste. Using saffron, cinnamon, or nutmeg wasn't just a way to flavor food. It was a clear indicator of wealth and status. The nobility wanted to show off their access to exotic ingredients, which, ironically, weren't always all that tasty when used in excess. A heavy dose of cinnamon could quickly turn a simple dish into something more akin to a dessert. And that was often the point. But for the average person, say, a peasant, who could barely afford a piece of bread, spices were mostly off limits. Instead, they made do with more basic herbs, like parsley, thyme, and sage, and these were used in relatively small amounts, simply to make their pottage or bread a little less bland. This meant that, for most people, food was still far from flavorful. The idea of cooking a dish that was seasoned just right or spiced perfectly was a luxury few could afford. If you had a little bit of fajt or some dried herbs, you were living the high life. And yet, the fascination with spices didn't stop there. Spices were also believed to have medicinal properties, which made them even more valuable. They weren't just for cooking, they were also used in remedies for all sorts of ailments. Cinnamon, for instance, was thought to help with digestion and to act as a remedy for colds, while ginger was believed to help with nausea and other stomach issues. So, even though these spices might not have made your food taste particularly good, they were seen as essential for your health. In a time when diseases were rampant and medicine was primitive, if you could afford a little spice, you were basically living your best life. For the nobility, the idea of spices as medicine was also intertwined with the practice of eating to purge the body. There was a strong belief in balancing the body's humors hot, cold, wet, and dry, and many medieval cooks would prepare dishes with the intention of restoring balance to the body. This is where the spice trade came into play. The luxurious spices were more than just food. They were part of a greater system of health, wealth, and indulgence. Now, here's the thing. While spices were all the rage among the rich, they didn't always know how to use them effectively. A stew that's laced with a bit too much pepper, or a meat dish doused in cinnamon, could end up being overpowered by the seasoning. If you were a noble trying to impress your guests with your access to exotic spices, you might have ended up with a dish that was more about showing off your wealth than about eating something truly delicious. Too much spice could turn a meal from savory to sweet, or from pungent to overpowering. Historians still debate how much the medieval elite truly appreciated their spices, or whether they were just used as a way of demonstrating their wealth. Were they really adding to depth of flavor to their meals? Or were they simply masking the fact that their food had gone bad? It's hard to say. But the reality is that the spice trade was as much about status as it was about taste. For the lower classes, the idea of spices as a symbol of status was never more than a distant dream. Spices were a luxury, not a necessity, and they were far more likely to get their food from a local market than from a wealthy merchant bringing in goods from afar. Herbs like garlic and onion were used more out of necessity than out of desire for gourmet flavor. Still, the smell of garlic and onions sizzling in a pot must have been one of the few redeeming qualities of medieval cooking. In the end, spices weren't just about improving flavor in the way we think of them today. They were a status symbol, a health remedy, and a tool for survival. They could cover up the worst aspects of medieval food, but they couldn't disguise the harsh reality that many people's meals were still nothing to get excited about. So, the next time you sprinkle a little pepper on your dinner, or add some cinnamon to your dessert. Take a moment to think about the medieval people who were using those very same spices, not just to make their food taste better, but to survive in a world where fresh, flavorful food was a luxury that few could afford. Let's take a break from spices and turn our attention to something that, in theory, should have been a refreshing and nutritious choice. Fish. Fish, the idea of which sounds so simple and appealing, especially when fresh and cooked to perfection. Yet, if you were living in medieval times, fish wasn't always the delicious, light meal you might expect. In fact, depending on where you were and what time of year it was, medieval fish could either be a delicacy or something that might even make you sick. For starters, let's talk about the kinds of fish medieval people ate. The wealthier classes might have enjoyed fresh fish from lakes or rivers, or even seafood brought in from the coasts. Think trout, pike, or salmon. But these fresh fish were a luxury for those who lived near water or could afford to pay for it. For the majority of people, especially those living inland, getting fresh fish was rare. So, most of the fish people ate would have been preserved in one of two ways: salting or drying. Fish like herring and cod were often salted to prolong their shelf life, a method that could preserve them for months or even longer. The salting process wasn't particularly kind to the fish's flavor, and it certainly didn't do anything for the texture. You might think that a salted fish would be a bit more palatable after being soaked in water to rehydrate it, but the reality was often much grimmer. You'd likely end up with a piece of fish that was so salty that it could make your mouth feel like you just licked a rock. But that wasn't the worst of it. Medieval preservation methods were far from perfect, and as you might have guessed, fish didn't always stay as fresh as it should. Spoiled fish, which often didn't smell as bad as it should, could make you quite ill if you were unlucky enough to eat it. A lot of medieval people were exposed to foodborne illnesses from spoiled fish, and even today, historians argue over just how much spoiled food contributed to disease in the medieval period. Historians still debate whether medieval preservation techniques like salting and drying were truly effective or just a necessary evil. While salting might have kept fish edible for longer, it didn't stop the fact that over time it could become dangerous to eat. The problem was compounded by the lack of refrigeration and the general lack of food safety knowledge at the time. Some medieval fish had a habit of turning rancid in ways that couldn't be detected by smell alone. People often had no choice but to eat what they had, hoping they wouldn't pay the price later. Fish, of course, wasn't just a part of the regular diet for everyone. Religious observance played a huge role in its consumption. You see, for much of medieval Europe, there were strict rules about eating meat on certain days, particularly during Lent. On days when meat was prohibited, fish was the alternative. This led to an interesting social dynamic. While some people could enjoy fish as a luxury or delicacy, for others, it was a replacement for meat, and often came to symbolize deprivation rather than enjoyment. But if you were a nobleman, fish could be a real treat, even if it was preserved. The idea of eating something exotic, like sturgeon or eel, would be a reminder of your status. Then, we have the issue of freshness. Again, you see, even in coastal areas where fresh fish was more readily available, there was still no real way to ensure that the fish you were eating was truly fresh. With no refrigeration, fish had to be eaten quickly, or it would spoil. If you lived by the coast, you might have had access to fresh fish on a regular basis, but even then, the lack of preservation meant that your fish could turn bad very quickly. And in those days, when it did go bad, you could be in for more than just an unpleasant meal. Spoiled fish could lead to food poisoning and other diseases, which were rampant in medieval times. Even when fish was cooked properly and didn't turn rancid, it still had to be prepared in ways that, let's just say, weren't the most appealing. Fish would often be boiled or fried, which didn't do much to enhance the delicate flavor that fresh fish might have had. Medieval cooking methods, such as overcooking or boiling meat and fish, often destroyed any subtleties in flavor, leaving you with something that was far from fresh or appetizing. And don't even get me started on the issue of bones. Eating a fish with its bones still intact wasn't an uncommon experience, and it was something that people had to deal with regularly, whether they liked it or not. Historians still argue whether medieval people were more likely to suffer from foodborne illness due to bad preservation or due to a lack of proper cooking methods. The evidence leans toward both, as food safety wasn't exactly a priority back then. Fish, being one of the more fragile foods, was particularly vulnerable to spoilage. And when it came to preservation, medieval people didn't have much in the way of effective techniques. Salt could only go so far. In coastal regions, fish may have been a bit more of a luxury, and they were also seen as a status symbol. If you had access to exotic fish like sturgeon or even eels, you were part of the elite. The wealthy could afford to have fish brought to them from far-flung places, making it a highly coveted dish. But even for the rich, fish often wasn't served fresh. It was salted, smoked, or dried to ensure it could last the distance. This meant that even at the finest banquets, fish could often be a far cry from the fresh, flavorful dish you might imagine. Instead, it was tough, salty, and possibly not quite as appetizing as it appeared. So, next time you enjoy a beautiful piece of salmon or a delicate piece of cod, just remember that medieval fish might have been a bit more hit or miss. It could be a treasure or a potentially dangerous gamble. Either way, it wasn't quite the fresh, tasty treat we've come to know today. Now that we've had a deep dive into some of the tougher aspects of the medieval diet, let's turn our attention to something even more essential in the medieval world: dairy, milk, butter, cheese, and other dairy products are staples in many modern diets. But in medieval times, they were much more of a gamble. Whether you were a peasant or a noble, dairy could be both a source of sustenance and a health risk all at once. Let's start with milk itself. In the medieval world, fresh milk wasn't something that you could just grab from the fridge. There were no modern storage methods, and cows and other milk-producing animals weren't always easy to come by. For the peasants, milk was often a rare commodity, and when it was available, it wasn't guaranteed to be safe to drink. The milk would often sour quickly in the warm medieval climate, and without refrigeration, there was little anyone could do to preserve it. Drinking fresh milk, while possible, could sometimes result in stomach aches. Or worse, as milk would spoil more quickly than you could consume it. Historians still debate whether medieval people knew the dangers of spoiled milk. Some argue that they didn't fully understand how milk spoiled, or how it could carry diseases like tuberculosis or brucellosis, while others believe they had enough experience with dairy to recognize the risks. What we do know is that dairy consumption often came with its own set of health concerns, and fresh milk could be a gamble. People often didn't drink it straight from the cow. Instead, they would have let it sour and ferment, either naturally or with the help of bacteria. This would result in something akin to modern buttermilk or clabbered milk, which could be more digestible, but not exactly what we would consider appetizing today. For the wealthier classes, milk and dairy products were still part of their diets, though they too had to deal with the challenges of spoilage. If you had access to fresh milk, you could also make butter, cheese, and other dairy-based products. But like everything else in medieval cuisine, these products were not always made with the same level of care and precision we'd expect. In modern kitchens, butter was often churned in the simplest of ways, and it could be rancid before it even made it to the table. Cheese, on the other hand, could vary greatly in quality. Some cheeses were aged for long periods of time, leading to rich, flavorful cheeses, while others might have been soft, sour, or too salty to enjoy. Cheese, in particular, was a favorite among medieval folk. For the peasants, it was a relatively easy and inexpensive way to get a little bit of protein and fat into their diets. Cheese could be made from cows, goats, or sheep's milk, and it could be stored for months, making it a handy addition to the medieval larder. However, the process of making cheese wasn't exactly refined, and the resulting product could be unpleasant in taste and texture. Some cheeses were soft, mushy, or overly salty, while others were so hard and dry that they could only be used for grating, if they were even edible at all. Historians still argue about the quality of medieval cheese. Was it consistently bad, or were there some truly fine cheeses that have been lost to history? Some suggest that medieval cheese-making was not as sophisticated as it is today, and many cheeses were made under unsanitary conditions. However, there's evidence that some cheeses from the medieval period were highly regarded and enjoyed for their rich, tangy flavor. The problem is, the vast majority of cheese would have been made without modern tools or methods, so consistency was hard to achieve. And then we have butter. Butter in the medieval world wasn't the smooth, creamy spread you might use to top your toast. Instead, it was often churned from milk or cream, and the process was rudimentary at best. Sometimes, butter was salted to preserve it, but more often than not, it was consumed fresh. The quality of the butter was dependent on how clean the milk was and how well it was churned, meaning there was a real possibility of getting something sour or rancid. In fact, for medieval people, butter wasn't always a luxurious food item. It was actually quite a practical one for the rich. Butter might be used as a topping for bread or as a way to cook other foods. For the poor, butter was sometimes a rare treat, an indulgence that could add a little and flavor to an otherwise bland meal. In either case, butter wasn't a universal staple. It was often just a part of a larger meal, where it was used sparingly to add richness. But here's the kicker. Dairy, despite its risks, was an essential part of medieval diets. It wasn't just used for flavor or texture, but also for nutrition. It provided fat, protein, and vitamins that were difficult to find in other foods. This made dairy particularly important for people who didn't have regular access to meat. However, the health risks associated with dairy products were always present, and people often had to deal with sour or spoiled milk, rancid butter, and questionable cheeses. Even the noble classes, with their access to better quality dairy, weren't immune from the occasional bout of food-borne illness. So, the next time you spread a thick layer of butter on your toast, or enjoy a nice, sharp cheese, just remember the medieval folks who were making do with what little dairy they had. It wasn't always the smooth, creamy treat we associate with these products today. For them, dairy was often a matter of survival, and the risk of spoiled milk or rancid butter was just another hurdle in the already difficult world of medieval food. Now that we've taken a look at the rough and tumble of medieval dairy, let's shift gears and talk about something that was supposed to be the refreshment of the day: vegetables. Yes, we've already covered the basics of the medieval vegetable landscape, but now let's dig deeper into how these humble plants were treated in the medieval kitchen. And trust me, the verdict isn't pretty. While the idea of eating your greens is something we hold dear today, back in medieval times, vegetables were a neglected part of the diet, often relegated to an afterthought or a poor substitute for meat. For most people, vegetables were rarely part of a meal in the way we might expect today. The lower classes, who relied on whatever they could grow themselves, had access to a small variety of vegetables like cabbage, leeks, onions, peas, and beans. But these weren't always fresh and vibrant like the produce you might pick up at your local farmer's market. Vegetables were hard to grow, and what you could harvest often didn't make it to the table. in a condition that could be described as appetizing. Cabbage, for instance, was often seen as a poor man's food, and it was regularly overcooked or poorly prepared, making it not exactly the best choice for nutrition or taste. For the wealthy, the story wasn't much better. While they may have had access to a greater variety of vegetables, spinach, asparagus, and carrots, for example, these vegetables were often boiled to death. Medieval cooking methods didn't exactly prioritize the preservation of nutrients or flavor. The most common preparation method for vegetables was boiling them in a large pot with salt and herbs, sometimes for hours, until they were mushy and bland. There were no delicate steaming methods to preserve texture and taste, no sautéing to bring out the natural sweetness of vegetables. Instead, medieval cooks often took the set approach, resulting in a soggy mess on your plate. Historians still argue about why vegetables were treated this way. Some say that vegetables just didn't have the same prestige as meat, and their preparation reflected that lower status. Others argue that the medieval approach to food was much more about sustenance than about flavor. After all, if you had enough to fill your stomach and keep you alive, that was often considered sufficient. The idea of gourmet vegetables or thoughtfully prepared dishes simply wasn't a concept on most people's radar, especially in the lower classes. But it wasn't just a matter of bad cooking. Vegetables, for many medieval people, weren't the primary source of nutrition. That honor went to grains, beans, and bread foods that could provide a quick calorie boost without the hassle of preparing something that required delicate care. And let's face it, medieval peasants didn't have the luxury of spending hours perfecting their vegetable dishes. They were more concerned with survival, and that meant focusing on the food that was easiest to grow, preserve, and prepare. That meant beans, grains, and occasionally some wilted greens. If we look at the upper classes, we see a different set of issues. While they might have enjoyed fresh vegetables, their use was often limited to serving as a side dish or an accompaniment to meat. These vegetables, again, were usually overcooked, boiled into submission, and presented as an afterthought next to more important dishes like roasted meats or pies. Vegetables just weren't the star of the show, and they were often treated as an afterthought, to be boiled down into something resembling a mushy stew, or hidden under layers of sauce or gravy. The problem also lay in the preservation techniques available at the time. Without refrigeration, fresh vegetables had a very short shelf life. Once picked, they started to lose their freshness almost immediately, which meant that what you got in the market or in your garden often wasn't anything to get excited about. In some cases, vegetables would be dried or salted to preserve them, but that didn't exactly make them more appetizing. A dried cabbage leaf, for instance, wouldn't exactly be something you'd want to throw in your salad. The result was that, for the most part, medieval vegetables were bland, tough, or unappealing in texture. Even when they were fresh, they weren't particularly flavorful, especially when compared to modern varieties that have been bred for taste and texture. So, for many people, eating vegetables was more about the nutritional value rather than any joy of eating. It wasn't until much later in history, with the advent of more advanced agricultural techniques and better cooking methods, that vegetables began to be treated as more than just a filler for meals. Historians still debate the role of vegetables in medieval diets. Some argue that their poor treatment in cooking was a result of their social status, seen as food for the poor, not the elite. Others suggest that medieval people simply didn't have the same understanding of the importance of fresh produce as we do today. Or perhaps they didn't have the time to prepare them in a way that would preserve their flavor. Whatever the case, the end result was the same. Vegetables weren't something that most people looked forward to eating. So, the next time you sit down to a crisp salad or a plate of beautifully roasted vegetables, take a moment to appreciate just how far we've come from those days of mushy, overcooked greens and bland, tasteless side dishes. Medieval people didn't have that luxury. They were just trying to make sure they could stay alive long enough to get to the next meal. Let's take a moment to reflect on the most common drink of medieval times, which was not necessarily something that quenched your thirst or refreshed you after a long day. No, in medieval Europe, you weren't running to the fridge for a cold soda or even a glass of water. Instead, you drank ale, mead, and wine, and you drank it often. These beverages were so ubiquitous that they practically defined the medieval drinking culture. But don't be fooled by their glamour or their modern associations with festive occasions. Medieval alcohol was more about necessity and survival than anything else. First off, let's start with ale. Ale was the drink of choice for just about everyone in the medieval world. The peasants drank it, the clergy drank it, and the kings and queens drank it for the common folk. Ale was a staple that provided calories and hydration. Yes, hydration. Because in the medieval world, drinking water wasn't always safe. Streams and wells were often contaminated, and the lack of sanitation meant that drinking water could be a risky proposition. So, what did people do? They drank ale, which, while not exactly the crisp, refreshing beverage we might imagine today, was at least safer than drinking untreated water. But medieval ale wasn't like the finely crafted beers we drink today. It was thick, sometimes flat, and often a little sour. It was made with various grains, barley being the most common, and fermented in a rudimentary way. The brewing process wasn't particularly refined, so the ale could end up being inconsistent in flavor. Sometimes it was more like a thick, porridge-like substance than a drink, and you wouldn't exactly be sipping on it in moderation. Instead, medieval ale was often consumed in large quantities. There wasn't much else to drink, so a lot of people just had a jug of ale on hand at all times. If you were a peasant working hard in the fields, ale was your go-to beverage to both hydrate and fuel your day. Historians still debate whether ale was always as bad as it sounds. Some suggest that it was a simple, cheap way to fill your stomach, while others argue that ale could have some level of flavor, depending on who brewed it. But there's no denying that it was less about the taste and more about keeping people alive in a world where fresh water wasn't always available. Ale wasn't just for the poor either. The nobility had their own versions of ale, though these were probably sweeter, stronger, and more flavorful. Still, they were often no better than a high-proof, homemade brew by today's standards. Next up, we have mead. Something that may sound more like a Viking feast than a medieval table staple. But believe it or not, mead was popular in medieval Europe, made from fermented honey, water, and sometimes fruits or spices. Mead was a drink enjoyed by the upper classes, especially at feasts or celebrations. Mead was sweeter than ale, with a distinct honey flavor, and could vary in strength and sweetness depending on the quality of the honey and the fermentation process. If you were lucky enough to indulge in mead, you'd probably be part of the wealthier crowd, enjoying it during a lavish feast or a special occasion. But for all its sweet allure, mead had its drawbacks. Like ale, it wasn't always consistently good. Mead could be too sweet or overly alcoholic, and the fermentation process was often unpredictable. Still, mead was often considered the drink of the elite. It was a luxurious drink that represented a certain status. If you were invited to a royal banquet, you might expect to sip on a goblet of mead while feasting on roast meats. But let's be honest, it was probably a bit rough around the edges, even for the wealthy. No refined cocktails or smooth wine here. Mead was as rustic as they come. And then, of course, there's wine, the drink of the ancients, and one that the medieval nobility held in high regard. Wine, especially red wine, was often considered the drink of the wealthy, with its association with the refined tastes of ancient Greece and Rome. But while the aristocracy enjoyed it, wine wasn't always as refined as it is today. Wine in medieval Europe was often thick, sour, and sometimes downright undrinkable. This was due to the lack of advanced preservation techniques, the poor quality of grapes, and the rudimentary fermentation processes. Wine was often watered down to dilute its strength, and depending on the region, it could have been spiced or flavored with herbs, which would have been a far cry from the crisp, dry wines we enjoy today. Historians still argue about the quality of medieval wine. Some believe that, despite its roughness, wine was still something of a luxury for the rich, while others suggest that wine was more about quantity than quality. The upper classes certainly drank wine, but for many people, it wasn't the kind of drink you'd savor. Just another way to get through the day, while avoiding the risk of drinking tainted water. However, the fact that wine was still viewed as a prestigious beverage by the aristocracy shows how important it was in medieval society. Wine was also used in religious ceremonies, and its symbolic value was enormous, representing the blood of Christ in Christian rituals. For the average person, though, drinking wine was likely a rare treat, and it wasn't something they would consume daily. For most people, the choice was clear: ale, mead, or watered-down wine, whichever you could get your hands on. Drinking these beverages wasn't just about enjoyment. It was about survival in a time when safe drinking water wasn't guaranteed. So, next time you crack open a cold beer or sip on a glass of wine, just take a moment to think about medieval life. While we might think of their drinks as rough and unrefined, for medieval people, ale, mead, and wine were more than just beverages. They were essential to their daily lives, their health, and their culture. Now that we've discussed the main drinks of medieval times, let's talk about something that's equally important, though much less pleasant: the impact of poor hygiene on medieval food. Picture this. It's a bustling medieval kitchen with a fire crackling away in the hearth, pots boiling, and cooks scrambling to prepare food. Sounds like a busy scene, doesn't it? But here's the kicker. Those kitchens were far from sanitary, and the food they produced wasn't any better for it. Medieval kitchens were not equipped with anything resembling modern sanitation. There were no sinks, no running water, no soap, and certainly no food safety standards. The cooks were preparing meals in close quarters with each other, often working with their hands, and sometimes without even washing them. In fact, hygiene practices were practically non-existent. If you were lucky, the kitchen staff might have rinsed off some of the utensils, but that was about it. Food was often prepared in open air, exposed to dust, dirt, and whatever insects decided to make their way in. This led to all sorts of problems with contamination, and it's no wonder that foodborne illnesses were common. The lack of cleanliness didn't stop at the kitchen either. Food preparation often took place in unclean spaces. Think dirt floors and open fires with no proper ventilation. In wealthy households, the situation might have been slightly better, but there was still no real concept of hygiene or food safety. In fact, medieval kitchens were often little more than a makeshift room with a stone hearth and some tables, with food being handled by unwashed hands, without refrigeration or a proper way to store food. Leftovers were often kept out, sometimes sitting for hours before being used in a new dish. The concept of leftover food being safe to eat wasn't really a thing back then. Historians still argue about just how much foodborne illness was prevalent in medieval times. But the fact remains that unsanitary conditions led to all sorts of problems. Food contamination, while not fully understood, would have been a constant concern. Without knowledge of bacteria or microbes, people wouldn't have been aware that improperly stored or prepared food could make them sick, and yet many still ate it because they had little other choice. Perhaps the most dangerous aspect of medieval food was its lack of refrigeration. Without modern preservation techniques, food had to be eaten quickly or preserved through methods like salting, pickling, or smoking. But even these methods weren't foolproof, and spoiled food could make people sick without showing any obvious signs. If you ate spoiled fish or meat that had been improperly salted, there was a good chance that you could fall ill. The fact that food could sit for long periods in unclean conditions only made matters worse. While we now have strict guidelines about food handling, in medieval times, the concept of cleanliness and proper storage was almost completely absent. So, when you sat down to that plate of meat, bread, or even a nice bowl of soup, there was no telling whether it had been handled in a sanitary way or whether you were about to face the consequences of someone's poor hygiene. The idea that food preparation was a health risk wasn't even on most people's radar, making foodborne illness a constant threat. Historians still debate how much hygiene really impacted medieval health. Some suggest that the sheer lack of sanitation contributed significantly to widespread disease and malnutrition. Others point out that medieval people, while living in unsanitary conditions, had developed some tolerance to bacteria and were perhaps less susceptible to foodborne illnesses. But the truth is, medieval hygiene wasn't something people could count on, and it's likely that they frequently dealt with illnesses, from stomach bugs to more serious diseases, directly linked to contaminated food and poor living conditions. The lack of sanitation wasn't limited to kitchens either. When it came to food storage, things didn't get much better. Most food was stored in pantries or cool cellars, but these areas were far from hygienic. They were often damp, dark, and filled with pests like rats, mice, and insects that could contaminate food. In some cases, food would spoil without anyone noticing, and people might unknowingly eat rotten or spoiled goods. Even bread, which was a staple, could be tainted with mold or other contaminants, and there was little anyone could do to stop it. For the wealthier classes, there was at least the illusion of cleanliness. The kitchen might have been staffed by servants who were trained in the art of food preparation, and they might have had access to more advanced methods of food storage. But even in noble households, food safety wasn't exactly a priority, and the lack of modern refrigeration meant that food still had a tendency to spoil quickly. Spoiled meat, stale bread, and moldy vegetables were just part of the medieval culinary landscape. So, the next time you enjoy a meal with everything stored in pristine conditions, with a refrigerator and a microwave at your disposal, take a moment to appreciate how far we've come. The medieval era, while rich in cultural history and traditions, was a time when food wasn't just something to savor. It was something that could make you sick without warning. The lack of sanitation, proper storage, and understanding of foodborne illnesses meant that medieval dining was a constant gamble. You might sit down to a hearty meal, but there was no guarantee it would stay down. Now that we've explored the unsanitary kitchen conditions and the risks of foodborne illness, let's shift gears and look at something a bit more extravagant: medieval feasts. These were the grand, sumptuous affairs that most people only dreamed about. You know, the kind of banquet where knights and royalty sat around long tables, piled high with food, where there were musicians, dancers, and the clinking of goblets full of mead and wine. Sounds pretty luxurious, right? Well, let me tell you. While these feasts were designed to display wealth and status, the reality was often a bit more complicated and less appetizing than you might imagine. At the heart of medieval feasts was the idea of indulgence. Indulgence in food, drink, and entertainment. For the nobility, these lavish gatherings were opportunities to show off their wealth and power. A nobleman hosting a feast could go to great lengths to make sure his guests saw just how rich and important he was. The food, while plentiful, was often symbolic of wealth, more about impressing others than about being something anyone would actually enjoy. A true medieval feast wasn't just about a delicious meal. It was a display of status and refinement. Feasts usually began with an elaborate procession of dishes: roast meats, pies, fish, and sometimes exotic dishes like peacock, swan, or even giraffe. Though that would have been rare and likely just a bizarre spectacle. The rich often indulged in meats that most peasants could only dream of, but the way they were prepared often left much to be desired. For instance, you might have seen an entire pig roasted whole, complete with its head, tail, and everything in between. And yes, it would be served with all of those parts still intact. Looking a bit intimidating, historians still debate how much these feasts were about actual enjoyment of food versus showcasing social status. Some argue that the excessiveness of the feasts, the mountains of roasted meats, pies filled with game birds, and multiple courses, was more about making an impression than about satisfying hunger. After all, the idea of eating for show wasn't just limited to medieval times. It has carried on into many parts of modern culture. But even if these feasts were meant to impress, the food was not always as fine as it sounded. Take, for instance, the meat. While a nobleman might feast on a roasted peacock or swan, the meat would often be overcooked or underseasoned. The methods of cooking in the medieval period weren't ideal for bringing out the best in any kind of meat, and even the richest feasts could suffer from overcooked, dried-out roasts. The lack of modern cooking equipment and techniques meant that even the finest meats often didn't meet the standards of today's chefs. So, you might have a feast that's overflowing with food, but the quality of that food could range from passable to downright unpleasant. And let's not forget the desserts at these feasts, which, as you might imagine, were not the kind of sweet treats we enjoy today. In medieval times, Sugar was a rare and expensive luxury, so desserts weren't the light, sugary delights we might expect. Instead, noble feasts featured things like fruit tarts, custards, and pies, which were often heavy and less than sweet. And the sugar they did have wasn't like the refined stuff we use today. It was often raw and uneven, which meant that the flavor could be cloying or inconsistent. A dessert at a medieval feast might have been more of a rich, buttery pie than a refreshing end to the meal. But the feasts were also about more than just food. They were social events, places where people gathered to celebrate, make alliances, and display wealth. For a nobleman, hosting a lavish banquet wasn't just about satisfying hunger. It was a way to assert dominance and show off. There were entertainers, musicians, and sometimes even jesters to keep the mood lively. Guests might drink heavily, sing songs, and engage in lively conversation, all while surrounded by mountains of food. But, of course, the food wasn't always the star of the show. It was more of a backdrop for the socializing and political maneuvering that was going on. Historians still argue whether the medieval feasts were genuinely enjoyable experiences for those attending, or whether they were just about surviving the food while indulging in the status and entertainment. On one hand, these feasts were an opportunity to enjoy foods and drinks that the average person could never dream of. But on the other hand, the quality of the food wasn't always great, and the extravagance of it all might have overshadowed the actual experience of eating. For the common folk, feasts were something entirely different. If you were a peasant, your idea of a feast was likely a much simpler affair. It might have been a special event, like a religious celebration, or a wedding where you'd have access to more than just the usual bread and pottage. But even then, it wouldn't have been anything like the elaborate banquets enjoyed by the nobility. Your feast might have included some hearty stews, bread, and perhaps a bit of meat, if you were lucky. But for most peasants, feasts weren't a regular part of life. They were rare, once-in-a-lifetime occasions, and the food was simple, but still a step up from their daily fare. The contrast between the feasts of the wealthy and the simple meals of the lower classes couldn't have been starker. While the nobility enjoyed piles of rich food, accompanied by entertainment and wine, the peasants were just trying to fill their stomachs with whatever scraps they could get their hands on. And yet, feasts were still a way for everyone to come together, share stories, and celebrate, whether that celebration involved delicious food or simply the act of surviving long enough to sit down at the table. So, the next time you attend a banquet or enjoy a grand meal, just remember how different the medieval feasts were. They might have been grand spectacles, full of rich food and drink, but the truth is that they were just as likely to be about status, extravagance, and survival as they were about actually enjoying a meal. Now that we've talked about feasts, it's time to turn our attention to something much more humble. though just as important in the medieval diet desserts. You might be thinking that a medieval dessert sounds like something sweet and decadent, like a fine pastry or an elaborate cake, but you'd be quite mistaken. While desserts did exist in the Middle Ages, they weren't what we'd typically consider desserts today. No light mousse, no frosted cupcakes. Medieval sweets were heavy, rich, and often a far cry from the treats we associate with after-dinner indulgence. So, if you were lucky enough to partake in a sweet at a medieval banquet, let's just say your expectations had better be set low. First, let's talk about sugar. Back in medieval Europe, sugar was a rarity. It was expensive, imported, and not something that everyone had access to. Only the wealthy nobility could afford it, and even they would have to ration it carefully. It wasn't like the granulated white sugar we take for granted today. Instead, sugar was usually sold in loaves, which would be shaved down into smaller amounts as needed. This meant that when sugar was used, it was a luxury, a mark of status more than a common ingredient. So, how did the nobility get their sweets? Well, sugar was often used in combination with honey to sweeten the few desserts available to the wealthy. Pies, custards, and tarts might be filled with dried fruits, but the sweetness would come from the rare and costly sugar or honey. However, these sweets were very different from what we'd recognize today. While modern desserts are often light and airy, medieval desserts were dense and heavy. A pie filled with dried fruit would be loaded with fat and sugar, and often wrapped in a thick pastry crust. The fruit itself might be stewed or preserved rather than fresh, making for a much more intense, sticky experience. Historians still debate whether medieval desserts were actually enjoyable or if they were just a way to show off wealth. Some suggest that the combination of rich, heavy ingredients was meant to display the wealth and sophistication of the host, but these desserts were rarely the sweet and refreshing treats we expect. If anything, they might have been closer to what we would call a rich snack than an after-dinner treat. Now, for those who weren't part of the nobility, desserts were far less common and often a bit sad. If you were a peasant, you weren't sitting down to pies filled with fruit or tarts drenched in honey. No, your idea of a treat might have been a simple bit of honeycomb or a handful of nuts, but even that wasn't something you could rely on daily. For most peasants, the concept of dessert was limited to what could be made from the scraps of the meal or whatever seasonal fruit happened to be available. Apples, berries, and other fruits were occasionally used to create simple sweets, but without sugar, those treats were often sour, bland, or fermented. Interestingly, the consumption of sugar itself was seen differently in medieval times. Instead of associating it with indulgence or treating it as a luxury the way we do today, sugar was often used for medicinal purposes. In the medieval mindset, sweetness wasn't just about pleasure. It was also about health. Spices and sugar were often combined in medicinal confections, believed to help with digestion or other bodily imbalances. For instance, in some cases, medieval desserts were designed to balance out the humors in your body. Sweet foods weren't just for satisfying your cravings. They were part of a larger system of health and wellness, believed to restore balance to your system. So, what would a typical medieval dessert look like if you were one of the lucky few to enjoy one? For the nobility, a dessert might be a fruit tart made from apples, pears, or dried figs, sweetened with sugar or honey, and spiced with cinnamon or cloves. These tarts might be baked in thick pastry crusts with the fruits stewed in sugary syrup. Alternatively, there could be a custard-like dish, often flavored with almonds or spices like nutmeg and cinnamon, that was both rich and sweet, but not necessarily the light and fluffy custards we're used to today. These were often dense, sometimes custardy, sometimes closer to pudding, but always filling. For those who weren't quite as wealthy, desserts were a bit less glamorous. You might end up with a bit of honey on some stale bread, or perhaps a boiled fruit mixture that was sweetened with whatever little sugar you could afford. If you were really lucky, you could make something like a simple pudding made from oats or barley, sweetened by whatever fruit you could gather, and enhanced by a little bit of honey. While it wasn't much, it was a far cry from the heavy, often bland meals most peasants had to eat. It was about as close as you could get to indulgence without sugar or luxury ingredients. Historians still argue whether medieval desserts had any lasting impact on modern pastry-making traditions. Some believe that the way sugar, spices, and fruits were used in medieval desserts laid the groundwork for many of the pastry techniques and flavors we enjoy today. After all, the combination of sugar, butter, and spices is still a hallmark of many beloved desserts. But if you had been living in the medieval period, you probably wouldn't have described these sweet dishes as delicious in the way we think of today's sugary confections. Instead, medieval desserts were often heavy, dense, and intensely rich. They were more about calorie-dense indulgence than about fresh or light flavors. So, the next time you enjoy a delicate, airy pastry or a rich, smooth pudding, just remember that the medieval version of dessert would have been much heavier, sweeter, and perhaps not as easy to enjoy. If anything, medieval desserts were a reminder that food, no matter how sweet, was often about survival and status, not pleasure. They weren't the light, refreshing treats we've come to love. They were dense, rich, and usually accompanied by an intense sense of indulgence that was perhaps more about showing off wealth than it was about delighting in a sweet treat. We've now ventured through the world of feasts, meager vegetables, and the odd dessert. But there's one more crucial aspect of medieval eating that we can't overlook: the health consequences of a medieval diet. It's easy to imagine that a constant diet of tough meat, stale bread, moldy vegetables, and spoiled fish might have an effect on a person's well-being. But the reality was even worse than it sounds. The health challenges in the medieval period were directly linked to the poor quality and inconsistent nature of food, and the consequences of this diet were far-reaching. First and foremost, malnutrition was a widespread issue. The average medieval person didn't exactly get a balanced diet. Most people, especially peasants, ate what they could get, and that often meant bread and grains. While bread could fill the stomach, it didn't provide the full range of vitamins and nutrients required for good health. The lower classes often lacked access to the kinds of protein and fresh vegetables that would support a healthy immune system. As a result, many people suffered from malnutrition, with issues like stunted growth, poor bone health, and weakened immune systems being commonplace. Malnutrition also made people more vulnerable to disease, and since medieval medical knowledge was primitive at best, the effects of poor nutrition were often misdiagnosed or left untreated. But malnutrition wasn't just about the lack of vegetables or the scarcity of meat. It was also tied to the overall poor quality of food. The bread you were eating might have been moldy or improperly stored, and the meat you ate could have been salted or smoked to the point of being nearly inedible, and yet there was no other choice but to eat it. The lack of food variety and fresh ingredients made it hard to get the right mix of nutrients, and this could lead to serious health problems. Historians still debate just how widespread malnutrition was in medieval Europe. Some suggest that people who lived in more urban areas had better access to a variety of food, while others point out that even those in the cities were often stuck with the same monotonous diet. In rural areas, where food sources were limited, the impact of poor diet was even more pronounced. This lack of variety meant that people were often stuck eating the same types of food day in and day out, leading to deficiencies in essential nutrients. For instance, the lack of vitamin C in the diet could lead to scurvy, while the absence of vitamin D could contribute to rickets. The impact of a poor diet wasn't just physical, it was also social, as we've seen. The wealthy had access to a variety of foods and could afford to indulge in exotic delicacies. However, for the peasants, food wasn't just about taste. It was a matter of survival. The fact that you could get enough food to survive didn't necessarily mean you were living a healthy, thriving life. The constant struggle to fill your stomach with whatever you could find left little room for nutritional variety, and the health consequences were often far-reaching. Another major issue in the medieval diet was the frequency of disease. Because medieval food preparation was so rudimentary, and because sanitation was poor, many people fell victim to food-borne illnesses. Meat that had been improperly salted or fish that had been spoiled could lead to poisoning or illness, and the general lack of understanding of hygiene made matters worse. The lack of refrigeration meant that food spoiled quickly, And even if it was still technically edible, it might have already begun to harbor dangerous bacteria. The concept of bacteria or pathogens wasn't understood, so people often ate food that was potentially unsafe. Even the lack of clean water contributed to the spread of disease. For much of the medieval period, water sources were often contaminated, and people had no choice but to drink from wells or rivers that were polluted with waste. As we've seen, alcohol, like ale, mead, or wine, was often consumed in place of water because it was safer to drink. But even these beverages, while safer, were no guarantee of health. Mead and ale could carry diseases or be contaminated with other pathogens that would make people sick. Historians still argue about the relationship between diet and disease in the medieval period. Some believe that poor nutrition combined with poor hygiene and living conditions led to widespread illness, while others suggest that medieval people were just more accustomed to dealing with illness due to the regular presence of sickness in their lives. What's clear is that the combination of a poor diet and unsanitary conditions created a perfect storm for disease to spread quickly and indiscriminately. And then there's the issue of obesity. It's easy to think of medieval people as being malnourished or underfed, but in fact, there were some who suffered from the opposite problem. Overeating. The wealthy, who had access to an abundance of food, could often overindulge, especially at feasts where the food seemed endless. There wasn't the same understanding of the dangers of excessive consumption, and many nobles would feast well beyond what their bodies could handle. The result was a class of people who, while eating better than the peasants, were often overweight and struggling with the health problems that came with it. Obesity wasn't just a modern problem. It was a very real concern for the medieval elite, who could afford to eat without restraint. At the end of the day, the medieval diet was a mixed bag of survival, scarcity, and indulgence. For the poor, it was a daily struggle to get enough food to survive. For the wealthy, it was a chance to show off and indulge in extravagant feasts. But no one really escaped the health consequences of a poor, inconsistent diet, the lack of access to fresh vegetables, the reliance on salted or preserved meats, and the general lack of hygiene all contributed to a landscape where disease, malnutrition, and health problems were just a part of life. So, next time you sit down to a meal, remember that the people of medieval Europe were just trying to stay alive, struggling with a diet that was as often a threat to their health as it was a source of nourishment. Let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture of medieval food culture, specifically what the people of the Middle Ages did when they were forced to eat on the go, whether they were traveling or working outside. If you've ever had to grab a quick meal on a busy day, you can probably appreciate how important it is to have something quick and portable to fuel you. In the medieval world, though, eating on the go often meant making do with whatever was available, usually food that was far from satisfying. For the peasants, street food wasn't exactly the gourmet experience we're used to today. In fact, street food in the medieval period was often just about getting enough calories to make it through the day. Most peasants worked the land, tending to animals, or working in the fields, and a proper sit-down meal wasn't always feasible. So, what did they do? They carried whatever they could. A hunk of bread, a piece of cheese, or maybe some salted meat or pottage. If they were lucky, there were no food trucks serving up gourmet tacos or artisan sandwiches. Instead, people would often buy simple foods from local vendors or make do with what they had on hand. This reliance on portable foods wasn't limited to peasants either. Travelers, pilgrims, and even members of the nobility often found themselves on long journeys where food had to be eaten quickly or carried with them. If you were a knight, a merchant, or a pilgrim, your typical travel meal was likely to be some form of bread, cheese, and dried or salted meat, sometimes with a few dried fruits or nuts, if you were lucky. This type of food was meant to sustain you, not to satisfy your culinary cravings. Historians still argue about the nature of medieval street food and travel food. Some suggest that these foods were quite basic and uninspiring, offering little more than nutrition for people who didn't have the luxury of enjoying a full meal. Others believe that, while simple, street food could be tasty in its own right, especially in urban centers where vendors could offer more variety. In larger cities, especially those with markets, you might find vendors selling pies, sausages, or other ready-to-eat foods. But even these offerings would be far from what we consider street food today. They would often be filled with basic, inexpensive ingredients. Meat from the lower quality cuts, hard vegetables, and a lot of grain. There were no fancy condiments, no sauces, and definitely no trendy fusion dishes. The lower classes had to make do with what they could, often eating something plain and hearty that could be carried easily or consumed quickly. And, of course, street food wasn't just a quick meal. It also came with its own risks. Many of the food vendors had little to no regulation or hygiene standards, so the food you were eating might have been contaminated. This wasn't just about unsanitary food preparation. It was also about the food being old, spoiled, or poorly cooked. Given the lack of refrigeration and preservation techniques, the meat in your pie or the fish in your stew might not have been as fresh as it should have been. For the wealthier classes, street food could still be a practical solution during travel, but they also had the luxury of better food options. While traveling, the nobility would often be able to afford more extravagant meals on the road. They might have their servants prepare their food, or even stop at inns or market stalls where meals were more substantial than what a peasant might find. However, even for the elite, the food they ate on the road was still far from gourmet. It might be roasted meats or stews, bread, cheese, and wine, nothing too refined, but more substantial than what the lower classes had access to. But what about the quality of food that actually traveled with you? Even for the elite, it wasn't exactly top tier. Foods that could withstand a journey, like salted meats, dried fish, and hard cheeses, were commonly packed for long trips. These foods were designed to last, and they were often tough, salty, and bland, certainly not something you'd look forward to eating after a long day of travel. The idea of preserving food for travel was all about ensuring that it wouldn't spoil quickly, which meant the food was often salted or dried to the point of being unappetizing. The inconvenience of carrying food that didn't spoil was that it was usually unpleasant to eat. Even nobles traveling with servants couldn't always rely on fresh food. Traveling, especially long distances, was a tough experience in medieval times. The lack of access to fresh food and the absence of safe water meant that meals during travel could be pretty rough. And once again, foodborne illness was a concern. If you bought food from a street vendor, you were taking your chances. The food might have been prepared under less than ideal conditions. And even if you could get your hands on something fresh, it was often unclear whether it had been properly cooked or stored. Travelers often had to rely on their luck, hoping that the food they ate wouldn't make them ill. The role of street food and travel food also shed light on the social divide in medieval Europe. While the peasants had no choice but to settle for whatever they could carry or find on the go, the wealthy could afford to travel with servants who would prepare meals or stop at inns where better food was available. This distinction between classes made the experience of eating on the go a very different one for the poor versus the elite. While the wealthy might be able to stop for a hot meal at an inn, the peasants would be lucky to grab a hunk of bread or a piece of dried meat to keep them going. Historians still debate how significant food culture really was in medieval travel. Some suggest that food on the road was just as much a part of the journey as the physical travel itself, while others focus on the practicality of simply surviving on whatever food could be brought along. Whatever the case, one thing's for sure: eating on the go was an essential part of life for most medieval people, and the food they ate wasn't exactly something to write home about. For most people, it was just about filling their stomachs. No frills, no gourmet flavors, and certainly no luxury. So, next time you grab a snack on the go, just remember the medieval traveler struggling to stay fed with whatever scraps they could carry or scrounge up from street vendors. Eating on the go wasn't just a convenience, it was a matter of survival. Now that we've covered everything from unsavory street food to feasts, let's take a step back and reflect on the slow and sometimes painful evolution of food in the medieval period. The slow, deliberate change that took place over centuries in the way food was produced, stored, and consumed was crucial in shaping what we know as modern diets. But it wasn't just about better methods of cooking. What we're really talking about is a gradual improvement in quality of life that, for many, didn't come quickly enough. One of the key factors in the eventual improvement of medieval food was the rise of trade. For much of the early medieval period, the European food system was rather insular. Most people ate what they could grow, raise, or hunt for themselves, and trade between regions was limited. The result was a diet that, for the average person, lacked diversity and richness. But as trade routes expanded and became more sophisticated, spices, sugar, and even new types of grains and fruits began to trickle into Europe. Spices from the East, sugar from the Middle East and Africa, and new fruits like oranges and pomegranates became more accessible to the wealthier classes, and eventually to the middle and lower classes as well. Historians still argue about when exactly food began to improve in quality and variety for the average person. Some suggest that the late medieval period, especially the 14th and 15th centuries, saw the first real improvements, while others claim that it wasn't until the early Renaissance that significant changes in food culture began to take hold. Regardless of when it started, one thing is clear: the foods of the medieval world were a far cry from what we know today. The use of spices, for example, which had once been reserved for the very rich, began to spread and become more common by the time of the Renaissance. Cooking with a variety of spices had become a popular trend, making medieval dishes more flavorful than ever before. Meanwhile, in the realm of agriculture, advancements were being made that helped boost food production. The introduction of crop rotation, the use of more efficient plows, and better farming practices slowly allowed farmers to produce more food per acre. This shift in agricultural practices led to greater food availability, which in turn contributed to improved diets for many. These improvements helped mitigate some of the problems that had plagued medieval diets, namely the over-reliance on grains, bread, and pottage, and paved the way for a more varied diet. Yet, it's important to remember that even as the food supply improved, the medieval world was still struggling with the same basic issues that had plagued it for centuries: disease, food spoilage, and a general lack of sanitation. Foodborne illnesses continued to be a major concern, and even in the latter medieval period, many of the same bad habits persisted. There was still no refrigeration, and while improvements in food preservation had been made, medieval people were often at the mercy of the elements. Meat that had been bought, fish that had been dried, and bread that had been left out for too long were all too common, making meals a gamble for most people. Even the best preserved foods, like dried fruits or smoked meats, could cause health problems if not properly prepared or stored. But the gradual evolution of food culture also meant that medieval people started to learn better ways of handling food, both in the kitchen and in everyday life. Cooking techniques became more sophisticated over time, and culinary knowledge began to spread throughout Europe. More attention was paid to food safety and hygiene, though it wasn't until much later that modern food handling practices came into play. The development of better storage techniques, such as the use of cellars and early forms of canning, helped preserve food for longer periods of time, which was particularly crucial during harsh winters. One of the biggest turning points in the improvement of food quality came with the introduction of new foods and agricultural practices. Crops like potatoes, tomatoes, and maize weren't introduced to Europe until the Columbian Exchange, which occurred in the late 15th century. These crops would eventually revolutionize European diets, providing more calories and a greater variety of food options. But in the medieval world, the introduction of new foods was still a slow process, and many foods we now take for granted were simply unavailable or unknown at the time. Despite all the progress, food in the medieval period was still a far cry from the rich, diverse diets we enjoy today. The quality of food improved slowly over time, but the improvements didn't come quickly enough for most medieval people. For the vast majority, their diet remained simple, consisting of a few staple foods that were often monotonous and lacking in nutritional value. Even those in the wealthier classes who had access to more variety often found that their meals lacked the sophistication and flavor we associate with fine dining. Today, the slow evolution of food quality in the medieval period was a product of changing trade routes, agricultural advancements, and the gradual spread of culinary knowledge. But for many, the daily struggle to fill the stomach with whatever food was available was far from easy. As we wrap up our journey through the medieval foodscape, it's clear that while the Middle Ages were a time of hardship and struggle when it came to food, they were also a time of slow but steady change. From the unsavory meals of the peasants to the extravagant feasts of the nobles, food in medieval Europe was far from the gourmet experience we now enjoy. But the evolution of food practices, from agricultural improvements to the spread of spices and new ingredients, laid the foundation for the rich culinary traditions that would come later. The medieval period may have been a time of famine and disease, but it was also a time of transformation, one that would eventually give rise to the vibrant food culture we know and love today.